"I can work," she said. The words were quiet, almost lost to the dry wind that scraped across the yard, but they were firm. Samuel looked down at her. She was a slip of a thing, barely a woman, swallowed by a dark red prairie dress that had seen better days, its color faded to the shade of old blood and dust. Her hands were clasped before her, small but not delicate. They were hands that knew labor. He hadn't expected anyone, least of all a Chinese girl, alone, walking up the rutted track to his homestead as if she belonged there. He had posted the notice for a harvest hand in town out of desperation, a last gamble against the coming season. He expected a burly man with a thirst for wages he couldn't afford to pay. He did not expect her. The notice was for a man, he said, his voice rough from disuse. He was a man who spoke to his fields and his mule, and neither ever answered back. A strong back for reaping, she did not flinch. Her gaze was level, fixed somewhere on his chest. "My back is strong. I can reap. I can bind. I can thresh. Sun up to sundown. For a place to sleep. And food." The offer was self-erasing. It was the bargain of someone with no other options, and Samuel knew the shape of that life. He felt a familiar ache in his own bones, the ache of having no other options. He looked out at his fields of wheat, a sea of gold shimmering under the oppressive summer sun. It was his only asset, his only hope, and it was too much for one man and a small boy. The grain was ripening faster than he could work. Another week of this heat and it would start to drop its head, spilling his future into the dirt. He needed help. He could not afford pride. "The barn," he grunted, gesturing with his chin. "There's a clean stall. I'll put a cot there." She gave a single, shallow nod. Her name, he learned, was Lynn. She did not offer it freely, but when his son asked, she gave it. That was the entirety of their bargain. No wages, no promises, just work in exchange for shelter. A roof for a back. It was a language he understood. The house was a place built around an absence. Grief was in the grain of the wooden floorboards, in the single cup left to dry by the sink, in the empty chair at the small kitchen table that Samuel never sat in. He had built this farm with his wife, Mary. Her presence was a ghost that touched every surface. Her mending basket still sat by the cold hearth, a half-darned sock of their son still folded over the edge, the needle still pinned in the wool. Samuel could not bring himself to move it. He cooked plain, functional meals. Salt pork, beans, hard biscuits. He ate standing up at the counter, while his son, Thomas, a boy of 6 with his mother's wide, solemn eyes, picked at his food at the table. The silence in the house was heavy, broken only by the boy's small questions and Samuel's clipped answers. It was a household of 2 men, one too old for his years and one too young, both navigating the sharp edges of a world that had lost its softness. Thomas was a quiet child. He had learned that his father's sorrow was a sleeping bear, best left undisturbed. He played alone in the dust by the porch, drawing patterns with a stick, his conversations held with ants and tumbleweeds. When Lynn arrived, the silence did not break, but it changed its shape. She moved through the house with a quiet efficiency that was almost invisible. She took her meals after they had finished, eating the scraps from the pot while standing in the shadows of the kitchen, her back to them. She washed the dishes, her hands moving deftly in the grey water of the basin. Samuel found himself watching her, a flicker of something he couldn't name stirring in his chest. It felt like resentment, but it wasn't. It was the discomfort of an old wound being gently prodded. Her presence highlighted the emptiness, made it more acute. The first night, he laid out a thin mattress and a threadbare blanket in the stall he had cleared. It was clean, swept of hay and dust, but it was still a place for an animal. He felt a pang of something like shame, but pushed it down. It was what they had agreed upon. Lynn began her work before the sun had fully breached the horizon. Samuel would rise to the smell of a banked fire and find a pot of weak coffee already warming on the stove. She never entered the main house without being asked, but she seemed to understand its rhythms, its needs. She laid out breakfast for him and Thomas, a portion of oatmeal she'd found in the back of the larder, and then she would be gone, already in the fields, the dark red of her dress a stark figure against the pale gold of the wheat. She worked with a steady, tireless rhythm that amazed him. Her scythe moved in a smooth, clean arc, laying the stalks down in neat rows. She did not pause, did not seem to tire under the relentless sun. She moved like water, finding the path of least resistance, her small frame belying a deep, enduring strength. She was proving herself, one small thing at a time. After the fields, there were other things. She noticed the frayed hem of Thomas's only good shirt and took it without a word. The next morning, it was returned, a line of stitches so small and perfect they were nearly invisible. She found a patch of wild mint growing by the creek and began adding it to the water jug, a small, cool comfort in the heat of the day. She saw the way the chickens scattered their feed and fashioned a trough from a hollowed log to stop the waste. Samuel said nothing. Acknowledgement felt like a currency he did not possess. But he saw it all. He saw the way she saved the vegetable peelings for the compost pile, a habit his wife had kept. He saw her bank the fire at night to conserve wood. These were the small, careful economies of someone who had known scarcity, and they resonated with the constant, anxious arithmetic of his own life. One evening, he returned from the far field to find she had repaired the handle on the old water pump, wrapping it tightly with strips of leather she'd found in the barn. It no longer wobbled in his hand. The repair was silent. It was solid. It was an answer to a question he had not asked. Thomas was the first to cross the invisible line. Children have no patience for the careful distances adults maintain. For the first few days, he watched Lynn from the porch, his thumb in his mouth, his expression one of solemn curiosity. He saw her as a splash of color in his monochrome world. One afternoon, he followed her to the chicken coop, standing just outside the door as she gathered the eggs. She did not turn or speak, but she moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if to show him she was not a threat. She held out a small, perfectly brown egg to him. He hesitated, then took it, its warmth a surprise in his palm. He ran back to the house to show his father, cradling the egg as if it were a jewel. From then on, he was her small shadow. He would sit on a crate in the barn while she mended tack, chattering away about his day, about the hawk he saw, about the funny shape of a cloud. Lynn would listen, her hands never ceasing their work, offering a quiet hum or a small nod in response. He learned that if he was patient, she would sometimes show him things. She taught him how to weave a bird from a long blade of grass, her fingers moving with mesmerizing speed and precision. She showed him which berries were safe to eat and which would make him sick. She even seemed to win over Clementine, the farm's ancient and profoundly stubborn mule. Clementine had a habit of planting her feet and refusing to move for anyone, especially Samuel. But Lynn approached the animal not with a stick, but with a handful of wild clover. She would stand by the mule's head, murmuring in a language Samuel didn't understand, her voice a low, soothing song. After a few days of this treatment, Clementine began to follow her with a devotion that bordered on comical. The softening of the household was a quiet thing, happening in the margins of the day. It was the sound of a child's laughter where there had been none. It was the sight of a stubborn mule nudging a hand for affection. Samuel watched it all from his fortress of grief, and felt the first, tiny cracks begin to appear in the walls. He would not say thank you, the words were lodged somewhere deep in his throat, caught behind years of unspoken loss. But he began to answer in his own language, the language of wood and iron and earth. He noticed the way Lynn shielded her eyes from the setting sun as she walked from the fields to the barn. The next day, he nailed a new, wider plank to the overhanging roof of the barn, creating a small porch that cast a deep shadow in the late afternoon. He did it while she was working, and never mentioned it. When he saw her shivering one cool evening, her thin dress no match for the night air, he went into the house and took down Mary's old shawl from its hook. It was a soft, grey wool, and it still smelled faintly of her, of lavender and wood smoke. He left it folded on a crate near the entrance to her stall. He did not watch to see if she took it, but the next morning, she was wearing it wrapped around her shoulders. His reciprocation was a silent conversation. He found a loose board on the step to her stall and replaced it, ensuring it was level and solid. he began, leaving a second cup on the counter in the mornings, an unspoken invitation to share the coffee she brewed. He watched her mend one of his shirts, her head bent low in the lamplight, and saw how she squinted. A few days later, an extra lantern, its wick trimmed and its basin full of oil, appeared on the shelf in her stall. Each act was a denial of the cold bargain they had made. She was not just a hired hand. She was not just a body in a stall. She was a presence, a warmth, and his quiet gestures were the only way he knew how to admit it. One evening, Thomas fell while chasing a grasshopper and scraped his knee badly. He came crying to the house, but Samuel, clumsy and unused to gentleness, only made it worse. Lynn appeared at the doorway. She knelt and spoke to Thomas in her low, calm voice, then cleaned the wound with a cool cloth and bound it with a strip of clean linen. She held him until his sobs subsided. Samuel stood by, useless and mute, watching her do what he no longer knew how to do. That night, a perfectly ripe peach from the one good tree in the orchard sat on the crate beside her door. The man from town, Mr. Finch, arrived in a polished black buggy that looked obscene against the farm's dun-colored poverty. Finch was the town's merchant and banker, a man whose prosperity seemed to grow in direct proportion to the hardships of others. He was dressed in a fine wool suit despite the heat, and his smile was a bright, predatory thing. He was the one who held the note on Samuel's land. "Samuel, my good man," he boomed, stepping down from the buggy. "Just checking on my investment. The wheat looks good." "A fine crop," Samuel grunted a non-committal reply. He did not like Finch. The man's concern always felt like a precursor to a tightening rope. Finch's eye swept the yard and landed on Lynn, who was drawing water from the pump. His smile tightened. "Found yourself some help, I see." "Good, good. You'll need it to bring the crop in on time." He walked over to her, his gaze lingering in a way that made Samuel's hands clench into fists. Quite the exotic little flower to find out here in the dust. Lynn did not look at him. She finished filling her bucket and turned to walk away. "She doesn't speak English?" Finch asked Samuel, a note of condescending amusement in his voice. "She speaks when she has something to say," Samuel said, his tone flat. Finch chuckled and turned back to business. He pulled a ledger from his coat. "Now, about that final payment on the seed loan, Samuel. It's due at the end of the month. The interest, as you know, has compounded. The total comes to..." He named a figure. It was higher than Samuel remembered. It was impossibly high. "That can't be right," Samuel said, his blood running cold. "The original figure was..." "Ah, but there are fees. Late penalties from last season." "It's all here in the agreement," Finch said smoothly, tapping the ledger. "A good harvest should cover it. Provided you sell to me, of course. I'll give you a fair price." From the barn door, hidden in shadow, Lynn watched. She could not hear all the words, but she could read the language of the body. She saw the predatory confidence of Finch, the weary deflation of Samuel. She saw the ledger in Finch's hand, and the flash of despair on Samuel's face. It was a scene she had witnessed before, in other places, with other men. The powerful smiling, the powerless shrinking. Something was wrong. The numbers were wrong. She filed the image away, the sharp angle of Finch's smile, the heavy finality of his ledger. It was a small, discordant note in the rhythm of the farm, a detail that did not add up. The sky began to curdle in the late afternoon. The air grew thick and heavy, the color of a bruise. A strange, greenish light fell over the fields, silencing the birds and insects. Samuel stood on the porch, his eyes on the horizon, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. The wheat was ripe, heavy on the stalk, ready for the scythe. A storm now, a real gully washer with high winds, would be ruin. It would flatten the crop, beat the grain into the mud. Everything he had, everything he owed, was standing in that field. "We have to work," he said, the words aimed at the whole world. Lynn was already there, pulling the scythe from the wall of the barn. "We need to cut as much as we can," he said to her, a new urgency in his voice. "Get it inside before the rain hits." There was no need for the command. She understood. They worked with a desperate, frantic energy, moving as a single unit. The sky darkened with an unnatural speed. The first gust of wind hit them, cold and smelling of rain and broken earth. It whipped Lynn's red dress around her legs and tore at Samuel's hat. They did not stop. Scythe, gather, bind, carry. The rhythm was a prayer against the coming deluge. Thunder rumbled, a low growl that vibrated in their bones. Thomas, his face pale, helped drag the smaller bundles into the barn. Even Clementine seemed to sense the urgency, allowing herself to be loaded without protest. The first drops of rain, fat and heavy, splattered in the dust. Then the heavens opened. A wall of water and wind slammed into the farm. They managed to drag the last bundle inside and heave the heavy barn doors shut just as the full fury of the storm broke. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the rain hammered against the roof. Inside the sudden twilight of the barn, they stood panting, soaked and covered in chaff, listening to the world being torn apart outside. The barn, old and weathered, groaned under the assault. A piece of the roof tore loose with a shriek of protesting nails. Rainwater began to pour in, right over a stack of the precious, hard-won grain. Without a word, Samuel grabbed a canvas tarp, but it was too heavy for one man to manage. Lynn was there, taking the other side, and together they wrestled it over the stack, securing it just as another section of roof gave way. They were a team, bound by the shared crisis, the silent understanding of survival. They spent the night in the barn. The house felt too fragile, too far away. The storm raged for hours, a relentless assault. Thomas, terrified by the thunder, cried himself to sleep in a nest of hay, his hand clutching a fold of Lynn's dress. Samuel and Lynn sat in the near dark, listening to the symphony of destruction outside. The silence between them was different now, forged in the crucible of the storm. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the shared quiet of soldiers after a battle. "You have known storms before," Samuel said, his voice low. It was not a question. Lynn looked at the sleeping boy, her hand resting lightly on his back. "In my country, we have typhoons," she said. Her voice was soft, melodic. "They take everything. The house, the fields, the people." It was the most she had ever said about her past. In that simple statement, he heard the echo of a loss far greater than his own. He understood her resilience, her habit of asking for so little. She had already lost everything once. What was one more storm? He finally saw her not as a Chinese girl, not as a hired hand, but as a survivor, just like him. They were two solitary people, hollowed out by grief, who had found a strange, unspoken kinship in a dusty barn while the world tried to wash them away. The storm finally broke just before dawn. In the pale, watery light, they surveyed the damage. The fields were a disaster. A third of the wheat was flattened, beaten into the mud, a total loss. But two-thirds, the portion they had saved with their frantic labor, was safe and dry in the barn. It was not a victory, but it was not a defeat either. It was survival. Later that morning, Mr. Finch's buggy appeared again, picking its way through the debris. He surveyed the ruined fields with a look of practiced sympathy. "A terrible shame, Samuel," he said. "A terrible shame. I don't see how you can possibly make your payment now. Perhaps it's best to be realistic. I'll take the land off your hands. Forgive the debt. It's the Christian thing to do." The offer, cloaked in false kindness, was a death sentence. The pressure from Finch was a quiet, constant weight. He didn't threaten, he advised. He expressed concern. He made it clear that Samuel's only honorable option was to admit defeat and sign the deed over to him. Samuel felt himself buckling. The storm had taken his fight. He was tired, bone-tired, of struggling. What was the point of one more harvest, one more season of breaking his back, only to fall deeper into a hole he could not climb out of? He began to think Finch was right. Maybe it was time to let go. But Lynn watched him. She saw the hope draining from his eyes, the slump of his shoulders. And she remembered the number. After the evening meal, when Samuel sat staring into the cold hearth and Thomas was asleep, Lynn lit the extra lantern in her stall. She had not unpacked the small, cloth-wrapped bundle she carried with her when she arrived. From it, she took a few precious sheets of paper and a stub of a pencil. She was not just a field hand. In her village, her father had been a scholar. He had taught her to read, to write, and most importantly, to count. During a rare trip to town with Samuel, she had seen the county records office. The next day, she told Samuel she needed to buy thread. It was a small, believable lie. Instead of going to the general store, she went to the records office. She asked the clerk, a weary man with ink-stained fingers, to see the file for Samuel's property. She spent 2 hours hunched over the documents, her finger tracing the lines of unfamiliar script. And she found it. The original loan agreement, signed by Samuel and Mary 5 years ago. She copied the numbers, the dates, the interest rates, her pencil moving with quiet precision. That night, she found what she was looking for in the house. Tucked away in the bottom of Mary's mending basket was a small, leather-bound notebook. It was Mary's household ledger. In neat, careful handwriting, she had recorded every penny spent, every debt incurred. Lynn sat by the light of her lantern, Mary's ledger on one side, her own notes on the other. She began the arithmetic. One small thing at a time. The numbers did not lie. Finch had been falsifying the interest for years, adding fees that did not exist, compounding debt that had already been paid. The farm was not on the brink of foreclosure. By her calculation, it was nearly paid for. All the while, her small bundle of belongings sat by the door, a silent question. The harvest was in. The work was done. There was no reason for her to stay. Finch arrived 2 days later, a sheaf of legal papers in his hand and a look of solemn finality on his face. "Samuel," he said, his voice dripping with pity. "It's time." He spread the foreclosure document on the kitchen table. Samuel stood across from him, his face gray, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He picked up the pen. He was about to sign away his home, his past, his future. "Wait," a quiet voice said from the doorway. Lynn stepped into the room. She was holding Mary's old ledger and the papers she had copied at the county office. She did not look at Finch. She looked at Samuel. She walked to the table and placed the 2 sets of documents side by side. She did not speak. She simply pointed. Her finger rested on the original loan amount in the county records. Then she moved it to the first entry in Mary's ledger, which matched it perfectly. She traced the line of Mary's payments, one by one. Then she pointed to the inflated, fraudulent numbers on Finch's documents. The truth was there on the table, plain and undeniable, written in 2 different hands. Finch's face went from practiced sympathy to disbelief, then to a dark, mottled red. He looked from the ledgers to Lynn's calm, unblinking gaze. He was not being accused by a grieving farmer he could bully. He was being exposed by a quiet girl with a command of simple arithmetic. He had been seen. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was absolute. Then Samuel, who had been staring at the papers as if waking from a long dream, slowly straightened up. He moved to stand beside Lynn, his shoulder almost touching hers. He did not look at Finch. He looked at the proof of his wife's diligence, and the quiet courage of the woman standing next to him. "Get out of my house," Samuel said. The words were low, but they carried the weight of iron. Finch, deflated and exposed, snatched his papers from the table and left without another word. The sound of his buggy retreating was the sound of a long nightmare ending. In the quiet kitchen, Samuel looked at Lynn. He looked at her worn red dress, the shawl that had been his wife's, the fierce dignity in her eyes. He saw the small, packed bundle she had left by the door. His own future had just been handed back to him, and he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that it would be empty without her in it. He walked to the doorway, picked up her bundle, and set it on Mary's empty chair. Then he turned back to her. He said the one word that had been withheld, the one word that mattered more than any other. "Stay." Thank you for watching.